Welcome, humans. I am ready for you.
Welcome to Neuroemergent, the podcast about neurodiversity in the Pacific Northwest and beyond. I'm your host, Carrie Stewart Lengel, and I am actually autistic. My guest in the studio today is Leah Blankenship, a PhD student in neuroscience and founder of the Neurodiversity Alliance at the University of Oregon in Eugene. We'll be talking about the science of neurodiversity and also about the challenges of building community and building an organization for neurodivergent people. Before we get to our interview, though, I wanted to start this month's show with a little history lesson. President Gerald Ford signed the Education for All Handicapped Children Act on November 29, 1975, which means this fall we are coming up on the 50th anniversary of special education as we know it. Updated in 1990 as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, this federal law guarantees all children in the United States the right to a free, appropriate public education. In other words, kids with Down syndrome, profound autism, or other disabilities can't be excluded from public schools, nor can they be merely warehoused or babysat, even if their disabilities come with behavior issues that can be disruptive in the classroom. But in recent years, school districts in Oregon have been getting around the law by putting hundreds of students on shortened school days, reducing their instruction time to as little as 1 hour per day. Advocates for these children won an important victory last month when a federal appeals court ruled their class action lawsuit against the state had been wrongly dismissed by a district court judge in 2024. To gain a better understanding of this complicated issue, I recently sat down with Tom Stenson, Deputy Legal Director of Disability Rights Oregon at their office in downtown Portland.
It's one thing to have a law, it's another thing to actually enforce it. Oregon's perspective, which is not the law, is that they really are they're there to write the checks, and whatever the local school districts do, that's their business. But the law is very clear that the state has to actually actively manage the school districts and know what they're doing and know whether they're abiding by the law. Money comes out of the U.S. Department of Education. It goes through the Oregon Department of Education, and the Oregon Department of Education is not just supposed to write checks. It is supposed to make sure that the money is being spent in a way that protects children with disabilities, so that their rights are being respected.
Disability Rights Oregon is one of several organizations that teamed up in 2019 for a class action lawsuit on behalf of 4 families with children in Oregon public schools whose instruction hours had been reduced.
Well, so we've been working on this issue for more than a decade. You know, there were statewide conferences as far back as 2014, 2015, where school superintendents were basically being trained on how to do more shortened school days. So this was an idea that sort of caught on. There are people who are rushing to decide these are bad kids and we just shouldn't have them in our classrooms. And so often there's actually a really simple explanation. One of the most common is kids who have autism or a similar condition who are struggling with communicating.
Disability Rights Oregon is a nonprofit advocacy organization created in 1977 as an independent watchdog to make sure people with disabilities are treated equitably by public institutions including schools, prisons, jails, and hospitals. Disability Rights Oregon celebrated an earlier victory in 2023 when Governor Tina Kotek signed a law regulating shortened school days and aiming to crack down at what critics called unofficial suspensions. Ironically, however, that victory is what led a district court judge in Eugene to rule that the class action lawsuit was now moot, meaning that its claims had been addressed and made irrelevant by the new law. Because the wheels of justice grind slowly, it took more than a year for a 3-judge panel on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals to say, not so fast.
And the Ninth Circuit said the case is not moot. We need to know not just did Oregon pass a law, but how is that law being implemented? Are kids continuing to get shortened school days? If so, how much and why? These are all questions that were not answered. For 50 years, it has been the law that kids with disabilities can't be excluded from public schools. that's not the reality. We're continuing to see, real exclusions, limitations, isolation of kids with disabilities after 50 years. And it should not take us 50 years to figure out how to include kids with disabilities in education.
Maybe it shouldn't take 50 years, but the complexity of this issue, both inside and outside the halls of justice, may serve as an example of why social reform is so difficult. It's not a sprint. It's not even a marathon. It's more like an intergenerational ultramarathon relay race while playing chess.
Litigation is a tool. It's hard to shift these big programs, these big projects. It takes a lot of dedication and a lot of work. It doesn't happen overnight.
It's important to note that DRO's annual budget, about $3 million, is funded in large part by a federal grant as part of the Special Education Law, IDEA. By way of comparison, the Oregon Education Association reported $27 million in revenue on its 2022 tax return.
Making headway on this and having ODE hold people to account, there's a lot of money, a lot of pressure, a lot of lobbyists who are not in favor of that. And so moving this forward is very hard. Kids who have disabilities do not have a big lobby. They do not have a big, organized, powerful group. They have us.
Welcome back to Neuroemergent. I'm your host, Carrie Stewart Lingle. My guest today is Leah Blankenship, a PhD student in neuroscience and the founder of the Neurodiversity Alliance at the University of Oregon in Eugene. We're going to talk a little bit about the science of neurodiversity, and we're going to talk even more about the challenges of building a community and building an organization for neurodivergent people. Welcome to the show, Leah.
Thank you.
Can you start with just a little bit about your research focus in neuroscience, and how does it or does it not relate to neurodiversity in general?
Yeah, so my lab uses mouse models to study a particular brain region and the cells there. The cell type that I'm studying in particular has been found to be associated with opioid withdrawal and the opioid system in the brain, as well as with social behavior. So my project is kind of looking at the intersection of opioid regulation and withdrawal and social behavior. Studying social behavior has been really interesting for me, and that's kind of led me into a big literature review project I've been working on, kind of looking at mouse models of autism and how researchers study the way that different genes contribute to social behavior in animal models.
Are there studies that are directly related to autism that are animal studies?
Yes and no. So yes, there's lots of literature out there that is studying in animals and directly related to autism, but autism is a very human condition that's very associated with our social behavior and the way that we interact with each other socially. And also a lot of the way autism is perceived as a disability is tied to societal expectations of behavior rather than always being associated with those inherent neural differences that come with being autistic. And so when we study like mouse models of autism, most of the time there will be some single gene that has been associated with autism that then you can genetically manipulate a mouse model or other animals, usually mice though, for genetic studies. Now, we understand that there's I think at this point, like well over 1,000 different genes that have been in one way, shape, or form associated with autism. So it's a little complex when you think of, okay, is a mouse really autistic? Well, you can debate that, but we can study how the genes associated with autism in humans affect those behaviors in animals.
What I'm hearing is not that it's a little complex, but that it's a lot complex.
It's extremely complex.
So if you're doing an animal study focused on one gene, you might learn something about that gene's expression in humans, but that's only 1 in 1,000 genes involved.
The vast majority of the genes that have been associated with autism are really just broadly associated with neural development. And many of those genes are thus also associated with a long list of other neurodevelopmental conditions besides autism, maybe ADHD, maybe schizophrenia, maybe epilepsy is really common. And so really when we think about how do we define like what causes autism or what contributes to neurodiversity, really there's just this broad range of cool different gene variants that result in developmental differences. And then when those humans develop and experience the world and express different behaviors, we categorize that into, our categories of what those behaviors mean. But really when we diagnose, autism or ADHD or all these other things, we're diagnosing those things based on the person's behavior rather than some genetic or biological basis for what we understand that condition to be.
You talked to me on the phone about an event coming up in September that's related to science. Can you tell me about that, please?
Yeah, so another organization that I helped start recently is a group called Neurodiversity Innovation Centers for Excellence, and this is a group that I've started up with a few neurodivergent professors as well as other neurodivergent postdocs and graduate students at the University of Oregon. The original idea behind this group is to provide support for neurodivergent graduate students doing neurodiversity associated research. And so in September in Eugene, we're having an event at a place called Cafe Picori, which is a really fun, I think, very neurodivergent atmosphere. And it's basically just going to be a few of these neurodivergent professors and grad students, such as myself, talking a little bit about some of what we think of as neurodiversity, some of the controversy in the media right now around autism and science and how we study those things. And that'll be on September 4th at Cafe Picori in Eugene. It is hopefully going to be very open and accessible for anyone who has almost no science understanding and just wants clarity from people like us about a lot of the misinformation that's being spread in the news right now about autism.
So what do you see from your perspective as the most important areas of misconception about neurodiversity in the general public that you feel like with your good science background you would like to help people understand differently?
Personally, I'd like to say, I want to address ideas about, perceiving neurodiversity as something that needs to be fixed or always pathologized. And I wish that was kind of the biggest issue that we were facing, but there's just so much misinformation that's happening right now. I mean, there's the constant vaccine debate going on. There's the constant trying to blame every single possible environmental factor and people constantly promoting these kind of out there random pharmaceuticals and supplements and therapies that are going to help kids supposedly. The idea that autism is an epidemic, right, is kind of the big thing that drives all of that. Just kind of this belief that there must be something going wrong in the environment or in our treatment of children that is causing autism to rise. And there's a few things that I tend to bring up when I have those conversations with people. First of all, the first person that was ever diagnosed with autism passed away only 2 or 3 years ago. Autism is still a very new condition as far as psychiatry is concerned. And so just from that perspective alone, we should be expecting autism rates to still be increasing. Another factor that is a very positive thing that's increasing this is that women and racial minorities and ethnic minorities have been historically significantly underdiagnosed with autism. And so a lot of these increase in numbers that we're seeing isn't an increase of cases of autism, it's an increase of people knowing that they're autistic, especially people who, are, as society would consider, more successful or more verbal or more high achieving or whatever. A lot of people in that category previously would not have been considered for a lot of these things or would have been grouped under other terminology such as Asperger's syndrome. And now a lot of the community is realizing, if we group people purely based on how successful you look on the outside versus like the actual psychological distress that you experience trying to exist in the world that isn't made for you, that those people deserve a diagnosis too. And so there's a lot of different factors that go into why autism is actually increasing, and there's really like no evidence that there's some outside factor that is suddenly increasing autism at epidemic rates in our children or something like that.
So I have to tell you, in my head, I am imagining Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Yeah.
sitting here not listening to
Exactly.
you and thinking about how hard it is to fight misinformation. So
Yeah.
I come from the mainstream journalism
Right.
world, and one of the things that we've discovered over the past 20 years is, you can fact check the article, but the bell's been rung. Most people don't see the fact check.
Exactly.
So countering misinformation is incredibly hard, particularly if you're like trying to whack away at all the misconceptions,
is.
as opposed to having sort of a strong counter narrative that you're going to be talking about, which I guess is, in a way, the neurodiversity paradigm itself. You know, the language of saying, no, I don't have a disorder, I am neurodivergent. So I guess that's how we do that.
Yeah. It's understandable why some people gravitate towards these ideas, because society is telling you, like, your kid is never going to have a normal life or a good life based on what society says is a good and normal life, right? They're saying all these things, and then they're also saying, oh my gosh, and look, there's all of these things that, maybe this can be fixed, and they're just holding that out in front of people, and it's like, no wonder that is so easy for people to engage with. And I think, like, there is issues with science communication. Like, science is not as accessible as it needs to be in order to, like, hold any ground against that kind of sensational, like, idea that just holds on to people, and the extent to which that perpetuates through the population. If people aren't doing a good job of going out and actually communicating the results that they find, or communicating it in a way that's actually accessible to the average person, I think that's a big contributing factor too, is just poor science communication.
I don't want to get too far off topic, but again, from a journalistic perspective, science journalism is generally very bad. Someone publishes a paper with a result, and that gets reported as a new finding, and most of that's noise. Most of those are not replicable. The next person who tries to do that study doesn't get that result. But all anyone ever heard was that one news story, and some of them have incredible legs. So I'm going to change the topic and get us back to school, back to the University of Oregon and the Neurodiversity Alliance. So I would love for you to tell me about that and how you ended up founding it.
So before I went to the University of Oregon, I graduated from Portland Community College in like the early college high school program. And part of why I had done that program was because I was very academically successful in school, but socially abysmal. I really struggled socially in public school. I didn't know that I was autistic until I was 18, so right at the end of high school, basically. But when I found out that I was autistic, it was like the best thing that ever happened to me, because suddenly there's a name for what you're experiencing. But when I started university, I was kind of had this newfound understanding of myself, but still had none of the knowledge of how to actually build community. I just knew that I was done trying to be something that I'm not. And so I decided I'm just going to dive into my interests and try to find people that just liked the same things I did, thinking that those people might be a little bit more tolerant of my way of being. And then what was really the best thing that ever happened to me, the number one thing, is that when I started at UO, I sought out finding like a Dungeons and Dragons group to play with in the area as a way to make some friends, and ended up meeting my now husband, who is also neurodivergent, and he introduced me to his whole group of, friends that had been playing D&D together forever. They grew up in the Eugene area. And for the first time in my life, I experienced like real neurodivergent community that didn't have to be bound by the social rules that every other social interaction was required to follow in my life. And it completely changed my life. Like, finding out I was autistic was awesome, but the fact that was able to lead me into a real community for the first time changed everything.
Welcome back to Neuroemergent. I'm your host, Carrie Stewart Lingle. I'm talking today with Leah Blankenship, the founder of the Neurodiversity Alliance at the University of Oregon in Eugene.
And, I was thinking a lot about how neurodivergent students drop out of college significantly at higher rates. And when you transition out of home to school, or you move out, it's a particularly vulnerable time for those students. They have had this consistent support system at home, or something at least that they're used to, and suddenly all of that is gone. And a lot of students realize for the first time, oh, I'm actually disabled. Or they realize, oh, this impacts me significantly more than I thought it did. And I just knew that there needed to be something to catch those students. And there was nothing like that. Well, I should take that back. There was nothing like that was run by neurodivergent students. There's, the Academic Accommodation Center, which is fantastic, but they're there to just help you be successful in your classes. And so much of what defines academic success for these students is just being a successful adult, like everything that comes outside of school, right? And so I started the Neurodiversity Alliance, and at first it was just a small handful of myself and some other neurodivergent students. And then over the next year after that, the group just grew exponentially. We went from having maybe 5 people show up to a meeting if we were lucky, to now we have almost 200 students associated as members of the club. But running a group entirely with neurodivergent people, it comes with its own challenges, right? So during the summer the month between finishing my undergrad and starting grad school, I participated in this conference put on by ASAN, which is the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, called Autism Campus Inclusion. And it's a really awesome, basically, training opportunity for autistic students around the country to get online and learn a lot about campus disability advocacy. And that taught me a lot of skills that I needed, and I kind of brought that back to my group. And now we run a really large group with a lot of help, with a lot of neurodivergent students.
So when we talked the other day, you sort of elaborated about the different ways that you have to organize, maybe sort of redundancies. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that, because part of this, of course, is you're trying to find people like you, but you're also going to find what's different.
Exactly.
So what have you learned about neurodiversity from founding and running the Neurodiversity Alliance?
Yeah, I have learned so much. There is so many different kinds of students in this group, and for context, we take a very, very broad definition of neurodiversity in our organization. There's a really excellent book called Neuroqueer Heresies by Dr. Nick Walker, and we've taken some of our definitions from that book, and essentially we define neurodiversity as any way of being, that's different than the societal standard of normal. So some people try to limit neurodiversity to neurodevelopmental disorders, but we're much more broadly inclusive about what that experience can mean. We include traumatic brain injury, we include like depression and anxiety, a lot of those other experiences, personality disorders and everything. So there's just a really awesome variety of students in this group with so many different experiences and perspectives. But I think the thing that has stood out to me the most, especially like running the organization and collaborating with so many people, is really the way that all of those different ways of being have so many strengths. Like, there's so many different ideas just waiting to be discovered if you give someone the chance to express them. One of the incredible students that's going to be co-president of the club next year has ADHD and autism, and in order to manage being a university student with ADHD, he has like so many different like organizational methods that he uses to help keep track of his life, right, and keep things in order. And with the combination of his ADHD and autism, like, has combined these things into a special interest in like organization systems
management,
basically. And he's a 3 p.m. major, which is like planning and policy management and things like that. And so it's been like totally changed how we run so much of the club, and we're so much more organized because he has this special interest in like building the online systems and spreadsheets. But then on top of that, students with those experiences can provide those tools to other students who struggle with that. Because one thing I hear from so many of my ADHD students all the time is like, if I hear one more person tell me to buy a planner, I'm just going to lose my mind because it just doesn't work. At one point, this like, I think it was like 3 or 4 students started like a pact with each other where they like gave each other, they downloaded these like parental control apps on their phone that like parents would normally use, and they gave each other in the circle like the like unlock information or whatever, the password information for this app, so that they would have to ask permission from someone else in the group to like go on social media. And it was just kind of this like peer-to-peer accountability for like, okay, I finished this like list of things that I said I was going to do today. Will you unlock Instagram for me, please? By just accepting like, hey, this is how my brain works and it's different, and then getting to know other people whose brain works the same way, they end up building systems that actually help them do better in their classes, be more successful as people, that completely go outside of what like the average college student would have thought about, you know. And I feel like that's what I've like learned the most, is just that when you give people the opportunity to just lean into, okay, you're different, that also means you can think differently about how to design your life. And at one point I just came across this article talking about the way that autism can present differently in different gender groups. And I was reading it just as like a casual, oh, this sounds interesting to learn about, like, because that's what I did with my time. And I just was like stunned. And I was like in bed at like late at night reading this. So I like got out of my bed really quietly because I shared a room with my little sister, and like I went downstairs and just started scrolling and reading. And then I was like, what? I don't know how to feel about this. Like, I relate to so many of these things. And then I looked up like all these other lists of just like things that autistic people experience or whatever, and ended up like going to the like family desktop computer and like printing out these like paper lists, and then just going through with a highlighter and marking down all the things. And by the time I was done in the middle of the night, I had the kitchen table just covered with these extremely highlighted pieces of paper. And I was like, oh my gosh, I think I'm autistic. But it took me a long time to ever bring that up to my parents. You know, I was really nervous about, I guess, what they would think, like if it would change their perception of me, if they would think, you know, take it seriously, I don't know. But eventually I did, and they were, really understanding. I mean, they always treated me like, they knew I was like very different, but they always thought it was like, yeah, she's just kind of cool and quirky, So it was like a process, but they were supportive and understanding. But the reason I say I kind of found out that I was autistic without a formal diagnosis is that not very long after that, my mom just kind of like was at a doctor appointment and just kind of offhand to our family doctor was like, if someone was like suspecting that they might be autistic, what is that? What would a person do about that? And he goes, "Oh, Leah?" Like she hadn't said, and she was like, "What?" And he was like, "You're talking about Leah, right?" When I ended up going and talking to him, he was basically like, but your grades are good, so why does it matter? You shouldn't care about that. And so for a while I was like, I guess, yeah, maybe I don't go get diagnosed because like the doctor said, like, I guess I don't need to do that. But then it wasn't very long after that I was like, no, I think it would feel very significant to me, especially as I was considering getting into more advocacy work like I'm doing now. I think if I'm going to be involved in that, I want to have an official diagnosis.
There's just so much bound up in that because,
yeah.
So first of all, there's the diagnosis is of a disorder,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
And the definition of the disorder is A, that you have all these symptoms, and B, that they interfere with your ability to live the life you want to live enough that it's a problem. Mm-hmm. That whole definition feels problematic to me because it sounds like there are a whole lot of autistic people who don't have autism spectrum disorder. You know what I mean?
Right. But I also think that the problem to me lies more in our ideas of, like, what does it mean for your life to be impacted, right? And I think, like that doctor that I had when I was younger, there's this idea, it's like, well, if you're financially successful, if you're academically successful, then you're not impacted because we live in this society that like everything is about achievement and money and contribution, right? My perspective now after being involved in the disability community for so many years is like, I don't think we all need to be, financially contributing to society to be meaningful and worthwhile and still contributing to the human experience. Like, I have intellectually disabled people in my life that are like happy, fulfilled, thriving people, and yeah, they don't have jobs, right? But that doesn't make them any less. And so it all gets processed through that lens, but I think more and more people are realizing, and thankfully like some like psychologists are realizing, that like so much more goes into quality of life, right? We are a social species and we're meant to have community and connection with people, and when you feel like that's something you just don't get to have, but you don't know why, it's horrific, which is why it frustrates me when people ask, like, I don't know, should I get my kid diagnosed? Or when people say, like, yeah, like, my kid was diagnosed, but I don't want them to know. I don't want it to change their opinion of themselves. And it's like, they know. Your kid knows that there's something different about them, whether or not they have a name for it. And I think, like, the kind of newer ideas of how to talk about those differences are, like, really helpful because I am very academically successful and highly verbal, but there are a lot of ways that I like really struggle with my life. Like I really struggle to manage a lot of the like basic necessities of being like a person with a physical body. Like feeding myself is like the hardest thing ever. I don't like all the sensory issues that go with food. Like, oh my gosh, all of these different things. I tell people as many times as I can that I would not be in a PhD program. I might not even be done with my undergrad if I hadn't like met my husband when I did. And he's like my favorite person in the entire universe, partially because like everything about him, but also that our support needs like match each other in the perfect opposite ways, right? He's very much like a homebody that like just loves putting his like heart into caring for the home and like doing a lot of those things. So like he packs my lunches for me like every week, because if he doesn't, I'm probably not going to think about it. And sometimes I forget to eat the lunch that he packed me because I'm just so focused on my work, you know. But there's so many things like we manage for each other, and like I would not be anywhere near where I am without that kind of like live-in support that I have in him. And I'm so lucky to have that, and so many people don't, especially when you think that like community is inaccessible to you, because how are you supposed to meet someone that like meshes with you in that way, whether it's a roommate, a friend, you know, a partner. And I just think that that's like so important to help people meet other neurodivergent people for those reasons too. Like, we are most successful when we can do life together, right, in community with each other. And to your point that you said before about like community being a struggle, I agree that it is, but I think it's significantly less so among other neurodivergent people.
Welcome back to Neuroemergent, the podcast about neurodiversity in the Pacific Northwest and beyond. I'm your host, Carrie Stewart Lingle, and I am actually autistic. My guest today is Leah Blankenship, a PhD student in neuroscience and the founder of the Neurodiversity Alliance at the University of Oregon in Eugene. Go Ducks! We're talking about the science of neurodiversity and about the challenges of building neurodivergent community.
When it comes to like community and autism, I always think of like the double empathy problem. Have you heard that term before?
I think I have, but I'm not recalling what it means, so
it's
remind
basically
me.
This idea that the social disabling aspect of autism is always put on the autistic person. Like, if a neurotypical and an autistic person are in conversation with each other and miscommunication happens, the autistic person is said to be responsible because of their social deficits. When we think of the double empathy problem, what actually is going on is that you have two different ways of communicating. And if both sides of that conversation can learn to have empathy going both ways, right? That person just communicates differently than I do, you can break down a lot of those barriers. But this is just such a consistent theme, especially in research too, right? You know, it's funny, calling back a little bit to mouse research, one of the big aspects I'm focusing on in this literature review that I'm doing is that in almost every study I've read so far, when they test a mouse's sociability, the double empathy problem, I think, actually kind of shows up there as well. So the typical, most famous social behavior test for a mouse is basically you just put the mouse in this enclosure that has 3 chambers, and the mouse can walk between the 3 chambers. There's like a middle one that's empty, and then one on each side. One of them will have a small cage in it that has another mouse, and then one of them will just have like an object or something else. And then you can test like how social your mouse is. Like, most mice, because they're also very social creatures, will choose to be in the chamber with the other mouse. Whereas a lot of mouse models of autism will just not care. They don't avoid the other mouse usually and like go into the other side, but they just don't care. But this one study I read actually did 2 extra steps to this that completely blew my mind. One is they did a test where the other mouse was also a mouse model of autism. And then they did another test where the mouse model of autism was in the small cage as the stranger mouse, and the test mouse was actually a wild-type mouse. And what was really fascinating about this study is that the wild-type mouse in this study no longer showed social preference if the stranger mouse was a mouse model of autism. So if you looked at those 2 mice, not knowing their genotype, you would say that wild-type mouse was antisocial or had a social problem.
So I read recently about a human study that was about information accuracy.
Yes.
It was the telephone game kind of thing. The hypothesis was if people who are autistic have an empathy problem, have a communication problem, that they don't communicate well.
Exactly.
But what they found was neurotypical people communicated information to each other very well, and neurodivergent people communicated information to each other well.
Exactly.
It was the communication from one to the other that was the problem, which again means it's only the fault, quote unquote, of the autistic person because we're the minority. If 95% of us were autistic and 5% of us were not, then it would be a very different world that we live in.
It would be like, why do you keep trying to make eye contact with me? You're so weird.
So aggressive. That's so aggressive. Keep your eyes to yourself.
Exactly. Or why don't you just say what you mean? You're like just avoiding everything. What is that about, But I do think that's like another reason why organizations like the Neurodiversity Alliance that provide just a space for neurodivergent community are just so important. Like, I've had students come up and tell me, every friend I have made so far has been, like, from this club, right? And it's like, how cool is that?
It's very cool. So I want to thank you on behalf of people I don't know for founding the Alliance. Particularly, I'm thinking you did it as a senior.
Yeah.
Like, if you're going to found this group as a senior, your goal is for it to survive you, right?
Exactly.
So tell me about that. How do you go about building an organization to last?
Yeah, so a lot of like student organizations really aim their like officer positions at like upperclassmen because they're more likely to, be organized and have things kind of figured out. But for me, I was like, well, I want upperclassmen on staff to provide, input and advice to students. But I was like, I also should be trying to get like really new students involved in the club right away. The other thing is just having a large staff team. So that's one of the big things that we do, not just for longevity, but also for that's like our main strategy for running a group of neurodivergent people, which is that basically every role for running the club is done by usually like at least two people. We're kind of broken up into these different teams. So we have like the administrative team. Then we also have like the communications team that does like outreach, recruitment. Most of that team is like ADHD students rather than the autistic students in the club, right? But then we also have just social events that are there to just provide community, and those are also structured very differently, and our advocacy team is really focused on like making sure that those events are like really accessible to everyone as much as possible.
Yeah, part of what I'm hearing you say is making something sound easy that is not easy.
It is not easy at all.
I've been involved in some volunteer organizations, and the reason often it's a small board doing all the work is because usually only you can get 3 people to do any work.
Exactly.
So trying to build a larger organization with redundancies and backups and accountability, all of that sounds incredibly hard to me because I have been involved in volunteer organizations and it ain't easy.
No, it's not. So I got a lot of like tips and advice for that from ASAN and that like conference that I went to with then. And the end of my senior year, it was still a pretty small group. And I was like, well, there's a month until I start grad school before the fall term hits, and that's when the freshmen get here. And I was like, I want to be a much like better supported group, and I want to have a lot of outreach done for that freshman group, right? So the organizational skills I do have, maybe not the networking skills, but the organizational skills I do have, I had made this huge database of all the giant freshman courses, which had like 300 to 600 people in them. Chemistry 101, Psych 101, like all of these huge classes. And then I strategized with the other people that were involved in the club, and we basically broke up all these classes between ourselves, emailed all the professors, which was like really hard to do, and then like scheduled times to go visit many of these classes in person. We advertised our club in the dorm buildings with like posters there as well. But I would go and I would stand in front of 600 people and talk about the club, and it was so exhausting. I was basically like in the lab speaking in front of classes or like in bed like the first 3 weeks of that term. But I did it, and just being able to just talk to those students about the club and let them know, like, hey, we're here. We can help you get your academic accommodations figured out. We can help you, like, build, like, find community on campus. Yeah, it was just, like, really powerful. And then, you know, by the end of our second year in existence, my first year of grad school, we had, like, over 100 students involved in the club, at least online. And now, after another year of a lot of the same stuff, we're at, like, almost 200, which is pretty crazy.
That is fantastic.
Yeah.
I want to thank you so much for coming in, taking the time to talk to me. This is Neuroemergent, the podcast about neurodiversity in the Pacific Northwest and beyond. I'm your host, Carrie Stewart Lingle, and I'm actually autistic. My guest in the studio today has been Leah Blankenship, a PhD student in neuroscience at the University of Oregon. Leah founded the Neurodiversity Alliance after attending the Autism Campus Inclusion Leadership Academy, a week-long workshop hosted by the Autism Self-Advocacy Network, or ASAN. More information about that program is available online at autisticadvocacy.org/ACI. Leah will be part of a panel discussion on autism from a neuroscience perspective on Thursday, September 4th from 6 to 8 p.m. at Cafe Picori in Eugene. That's presented by another organization Leah helped establish called Neurodiversity Innovation Centers for Excellence in Neuroscience. And more information on that organization can be found on the web at niceinneuro.org. Neuroemergent is brought to you by Lonesome George Productions in association with KBOO Community Radio in Portland and KMUZ Community Radio in Salem. Our theme music was composed by Doug Lingle. Our production assistant is P.F. Lingle, and I'm your host, Carrie Stewart Lingle.